We are now getting ready to learn about group research design. This is probably something we see very frequently in social work research and behavioral sciences, and in the areas that we're spending a lot of time looking in. But it's appropriate for answering questions that deal with groups of elements such as people, organization, agencies. So when we want to say something about a bigger group of people. So let's just get started here. Let me get the screen going here. So some group research design takeaways. So there's some things I really want you to kind of think through and make sure that you're spending some time with. Terminology, that's a big thing. We're really starting to get into quantitative research and the terminology around that, and being able to read articles and understand them and talk about them. So it's a new language. So thinking back to learning a new language, if that's something that's in your world, or if we think back to very early beginnings of trying to understand social work terminology, we have that in the practice sense. We get used to it because we talk about it and use it more. It's not much different in research, we just don't use it as much. The independent variable and dependent variable, group research design. So what are they and the value that they have? Pre and post test, that can help us understand change within a group if we don't have that comparison, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And internal and external validity. So these are the big takeaways from this chapter. So let's spend just a moment on our kind of two types of variables, our independent and dependent variables. This isn't about levels of measurement. We're going to get into that as we move through, but just the two different kind of variables that we have. So an independent variable, IV, as we often see it, or maybe even say it, are the variables that we assume or are assumed in our research to be responsible for the change in the dependent variable. So when we have an intervention or we're introducing something into the study, right, in some way, that intervention is the independent variable. So anytime we're looking at outcome research, we want to, again, in our agencies, what we're doing, our interventions, those are independent variables. And if you're a visual sort of person, when you're thinking about it, when we kind of have these notations around it, and we'll get to this a little bit more in another video, it's the X of our scientific notation. So just thinking about that, if it helps you to kind of map out and make sense of research. The dependent variable then is the variable that changes in its values, its measurements, according to the independent variable in the study. So it's the thing we hope to change. Maybe it's the depression score goes up or down, right, depending upon the measure you might be using. So it's that outcome variable. It's the thing we hope changes. That's an O in our notation. So we've got an X and we've got an O here. So change in the DV depends, dependent variable. So the change in the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. And maybe that's another way to help you think through. Again, so it's that experimental condition that we're thinking about with the independent variable, the treatment modality, that intervention. And that dependent variable really is typically the thing of interest, the thing we're hoping to see the change. Sexual behavior, bullying, substance use, child abuse, right? This outcome, we're hoping to see it go up or down, kind of increase, decrease in some way based on our intervention, our treatment modality, that experimental condition. I think, again, these are just other ways to say this, and I just kind of put a couple of different slides together to see if one maybe helps you understand a little bit better. Again, these are not relatively complex concepts, but as we get into research that has a lot of different kinds of variables, it can be kind of tricky to think about what's the intervention, what's the experiment, what's the thing we're doing in order to achieve an outcome difference, right? So as the experimenter changes the independent variable, as we have our treatment, as we do therapy, as we have interventions at our agency, as we have after school programs, as we have all of these things, as we have equine therapy, as we have the horses, those are all our interventions that are dependent variable, right? We want to see changes in now, reduction in PTSD, we want to see an increase in this, a decrease in bullying, right? And thinking through those. So that's our independent and dependent variables. So let's look at this quick example. A researcher is interested in how the use of restorative justice in high school affects school discipline practice. They plan to compare two similarly sized high schools in an urban area, so that context is relatively similar, that use RJ practices with those that rely on traditional discipline. So we're looking here, we want to come in and say, we're going to use this new intervention, restorative justice. This is our new thing. They're going to collect data on the number of suspensions in both types of schools. So what would the independent variable be? And then what would the dependent variable be? Give you a minute to think through that. So in this scenario, we're thinking restorative justice is the thing we're bringing in. What we want to compare here is restorative justice versus traditional discipline, right? So we might have one school that does one school that just remains status quo. So that's our IV. That's the independent variable. This is the treatment, this is the experimental condition, this is the thing. So our dependent variable then here, if we're just reading through this, we want to know about number of suspensions, right? We're kind of thinking about school discipline and how we're defining that, maybe operationalizing that in this is number of suspensions, right? So think of a research question or a hypothesis. We covered that early on in the semester. What might we want to see? That restorative justice has fewer number of suspensions than traditional discipline. That'd be a hypothesis, right? Because we're having some direction. We're saying this is what we expect to see. So that's kind of how those two come together. So again, just coming back to our O for observation, that's kind of where that O comes from. That's the dependent variable. You've got X for treatment or experimental. That's our IV, that's our independent variable. And then when we get into it and we start to look at this, we've got an R, and that's for random assignment. So if we don't have random assignment, then often we're looking at that comparison group, which would be in our high school example. We might have one school just maintaining status quo discipline. We've got one high school doing the restorative justice. So we're not randomly assigning anybody to anything. It's just the students at those two. So we're going to compare these two groups in a way that has us say restorative justice practices are helping with the suspension rate. So that's quick into independent, dependent variables and some terminology.